I started to say racist and sexist jokes at times, and I got caught up in all that culture at school.
It's like, of course 8 and 10-year-olds don't know what masculinity is, because most 20-years don't know what it is.
We've seen over the last few years an increasing acknowledgement within our cultural discourse around this notion of a crisis of masculinity.
Men are in crisis, Tucker, as you pointed out.
One of the things when you're lost, you're looking for help, you're looking for appeal, and you don't critically evaluate the people who say we're here to help you.
You just yank it out. How'd you?
There you go. That's how a real man does it.
And so what often gets cited when people will talk about a crisis of masculinity is not so much just the lack of role models about what it means to be a man.
Come on! Come on! Woo!
From John Wayne to Rob Gronkowski, the idea of masculinity has been an important pillar of what it means to be a man in society. But increasingly, young people are searching for a definition. So we're trying our best to find one. We've tapped experts in psychology, sociology, culture, and entertainment in order to take a look at the so-called masculinity crisis. We'll dig into what's contributing to young men feeling lost, the lack of role models in media, and what happens when searching for answers takes you down an unexpected rabbit hole. Will Adolphy struggled with the idea of masculinity as a young man before becoming a therapist himself.
I run a company called Empath, where we travel the UK doing talks in schools on masculinity, mental health, and in particular my own experiences being caught up online in what is now being referred to as the manosphere.
To understand Will's situation, you need to go back to his childhood.
If I go back to when I was kind of 9 years old, I just remember having this real sensitive, almost innocent, tender, like energy. I come from a divorced family. There was a lot of stuff going on at home. And I had 19 surgeries by the time I was 12 on my ears, and they were complicated ones, major surgeries. So at school, I definitely fell into, I'm not fitting into the box here, because the parts of me that were sensitive were getting judged. I became an easy target, right?
What you'd consider masculinity differs among generations. According to a YouGov poll from 2023, a majority of older men are more likely to see themselves as completely masculine. If it's a spectrum, 50% of male respondents older than 65 saw themselves as completely masculine. But for men between 18 and 29, the youngest cohort in the study, that number dropped to 30%.
By the time I got into my 14-year-old teens, I started to do my best to adhere to what I would call the man box. This rigid set of rules that I unknowingly was trying to follow in order to kind of be a real man. And so I started to do my best to adhere to that, to get ahead, to survive in this environment. And I started to bully other people, and I started to be violent towards others. I started to say racist and sexist jokes at times, and I got caught up in all that culture at school. And I lived in my dad's old office in the end of a garden, and that became my gaming den where I would, play Call of Duty, masturbate, smoke weed, and I isolated. And in these photos at this time in my life, I can actually see bravado. I can see a real change, a mask. And that continued right into my kind of early 20s as I grew up.
Will's not alone in trying to conform to what he referred to as the man box. According to a study from National Research Group, 74% of young men think society expects them to act a certain way because of gender. Meanwhile, 53% say they feel pressured to act in a more masculine way.
And I remember as well there having some experiences where I got told, men have it so much easier than women. You have male privilege. That started to happen in and around the Me Too movement. We're talking sort of 2016 here. A friend went to a party as toxic masculinity. I was at a gig once and the lead singer said, men to the back, men to the back.
Again, these are not unique feelings. According to an Ipsos poll released in March, 56% of millennial men and 57% of Gen Z men said promoting women's equality has gone so far that we are discriminating against men. And 57% of millennial men and 60% of Gen Z men agree men are expected to do too much to support equality.
And I think the way I see that polarity is on the wounded men's movement. It's, oh, the progress of feminism is a threat to men and the world is rigged against men. And there's a lot of that. And this kind of righteousness or this resentment gets projected onto the other side. And then on the kind of wounded feminist side, which I was kind of caught up in and very hyper focused on back at this time, it's kind of the patriarchy is men, right? And so it's this sense of men have it easier than women, and that men, are toxic.
The idea of what masculinity is confusing in its own right. The NRG study found 43% of young men say they do not know what it means to be a man in today's society.
I think the reality is that for a very long time, we just use the term masculinity. And I think the problem with masculinity is that term with a Y is that it seems to denote that there's like one form of masculinity, when the reality is that there's multiple forms of masculinity, meaning that masculinity is a variable, but it's also influenced by other elements of identities.
Matt Engler Carlson has spent his career studying this topic.
I'm Matt Engler Carlson. I am a professor of counseling and department chair at Cal State Fullerton. My background is in psychology, primarily the psychology of men and masculinities. I'm a white educated male, primarily grown up in the Midwest. And so my whiteness, Midwesternness, probably middle to upper class, and being educated, like that influences my version of masculinity as opposed to, let's say, a colleague of mine who might be an undocumented immigrant from Mexico who is a first-gen college student, right?
It's not necessarily an apples-to-apples situation, but Ipsos found 28% of Gen Z men think a man who stays home to look after his children is less of a man.
The gender landscape has been shifting for a while now. For example, women are now more than ever in the workforce. Over in the UK, approximately 34% of UK households have a female breadwinner.
Because gender is something that we think about all the time, and we have lots of kind of implicit bias about it because gender is an organizing principle in our society. Some people might look at that and think, well, that's really horrible for men. They had to give up something. And other men look at that and think, like, what a great opportunity. Because prior to that, I felt like I couldn't be a present father, or I had to put work over family. And now maybe it's more, now maybe I can actually be more of a caregiver and be proud of it.
While researchers and academics can spend a year of their lives poring over studies related to the topic, the people molding young men generally don't have that kind of time. In fact, NRG's study found 48% of parents of young boys say they don't know how to talk with their sons about masculinity.
And the reality is that we know that also the brain, you're an adolescent until 24, 25. Like your brain is still developing, and particularly for kind of adolescent males, like identity formation doesn't happen at 12 or 13.
We haven't been examining or facilitating an evolution of masculinity and what it means to be a man. So that internalized sense of rigid masculinity and shame is still prevalent in our culture, but the culture is now putting pressure, or there is pressure on men to change and evolve as well.
Aggression, for example, is a masculine norm that men are kind of encouraged to kind of be aggressive and use violence, for example. And if you use that in a non-adaptive way, in a very, very rigid way, that means you respond to things with aggression and violence all the time. That's all you got. But the reality is like the more adaptive way is that you actually don't respond to that unless a situation occurs in which you need to protect yourself or someone, and then you respond in that way. It's actually flexibility and adaptiveness, which is healthy. And for the most part, unhealthy masculinity is actually rigid adoption of these models and norms.
To that point, some things which could be labeled as toxic masculinity are becoming less acceptable in society. Pew's research found 75% of respondents said it's not too or not at all acceptable for men to join in when men are talking about women in a sexual way. 69% said it was unacceptable for men to have too many different sexual partners, rather than committing to a single relationship. 63% said it was a negative for a man drinking a lot of alcohol when out with friends. And 62% said it was not acceptable for a man to throw a punch if provoked.
When we think about what toxic masculinity is, it kind of falls in two camps. The one that's talked about more would be this kind of like this interpersonal kind of toxicity, which is kind of power over others. It began in the 70s and kind of some of the men's movements kind of circles, but it kind of went underground for a while, and it popped back up around Me Too. There's also what I would call toxin actually masculinity, and the toxin masculinity is the intrapersonal elements around that. The toxin thing ends up being this pill that men swallow. That's why I use it that way, and in some ways, in many, many ways, like a lot of the ills that we think about in terms of masculinity is that, right? And for a lot of men, you know, it's a pill that later they realize they swallowed and kind of think, wow, I didn't think that was going to work out, that didn't turn out the way that I thought it was going to turn out.
Young men feeling lost often don't take the steps needed to address their mental health.
I would say that there isn't much support available specifically for men that are looking to challenge or could be encouraged to challenge what we've internalized, that rigid sense of masculinity, and then to actually be guided towards emotional maturity. You know, our culture has feminized care, and that meant that the services that were available just didn't feel like they were for me, and I just didn't really vibe with them.
According to data from the National Institute of Mental Health in 2022, nearly 20% of men identified as having some form of mental illness, including things like anxiety and depression. But only roughly 42% of those men received treatment, compared to the nearly 57% of women who received mental health treatment.
The same things that encourage men to kind of show power over others and to aspire to these really dominant kind of norms are the same things that actually probably are the reasons why men die 5 to 6 years earlier in Western societies than women, which is in order to prove our masculinity, we don't go to the doctor, we don't take sick days, we don't wear helmets or seatbelts or sunscreen or all these kinds of things, the health behaviors we don't do, you know, and that kills us, actually.
It's just very difficult in a culture where I might feel like I'm judged to actually express or explore these other parts of me and who I am.
It's that around kind of early 20s and beginning of young adulthood in which we begin to figure out like who am I, you know, as a man, as a person, as a you know, career identity, sexual identity, all these identity things come together at that period of time. So prior to that, you're just kind of swimming in a wave.
Will says at the time he would feed on his anxiety to keep the edge as he navigated the world.
I didn't know this, but I felt almost like I was addicted to my anxiety and shame. Like I felt a magnetic pull towards anxiety and shame because it felt safe there. It felt familiar. And we do live in a culture, I call it a work-centric culture, where the fuel is anxiety or coffee or caffeine. And that it does feel impossible to people, like it did to me, to foresee a world where I would be able to get stuff done and be as productive without the anxiety fueling me the whole time. And so whenever I was in serenity or calmness, there was a part of me that didn't feel safe there because it was like, well, I need to be prepared. I'm not aware of something. I'm not mobilized. I'm not prepared enough. And when a person is in that state of lostness, in the UK where I was, there's not much that is kind of offered outside of go to the GP, get on medication, maybe see a therapist. So I did those things and it kind of helped me to cope, but it wasn't enough. And And so I went online.
Will did go online and eventually found an influencer who he says became like a father figure to him. In the next part of our series, we'll dig into how role models factor into masculinity. For Straight Arrow News, I'm Craig Negrelli. Find us at SAN.com or download the Straight Arrow News app.